What is history? Although at first glance it seems like a simple question, it is not so easy to answer it. To do this, first of all, it is necessary to look at how the content of the concept of history is explained in scientific and philosophical literature. In various scientific and philosophical literature, the content of this concept is usually interpreted in two contexts. 1. History is a set of various types of events that have occurred within human civilization as a complete social system since its inception. Sometimes it is possible to distinguish two sub-contexts within this context itself. 1.1. History expresses the process of historical development, that is, the stages that social phenomena pass through from their emergence to their destruction, the new qualitative states and quantitative indicators they acquire. In short, it shows the historicity in the development of social phenomena. 1.2. History expresses the set of various subsystems, from the economic subsystem to the political subsystem, that are part of society as a whole social system. In other words, history implies that the event under consideration does not belong to another system, for example, to the natural system, but precisely to the social system, society. In this sense, we can consider, for example, a comparative analysis of natural and social phenomena, natural and social laws, etc. 2. History is a form of human understanding or assessment of various types of events that have occurred in human civilization as a complete social system. Sometimes it is possible to distinguish two sub-contexts within this context. 2.1. History refers to the reflection of the past of society in the brains of large social groups, peoples, nations, social classes, etc., historical consciousness. 2.2. The term history denotes the science of history, which is one of the important elements of historical consciousness. Thus, in the existing philosophical and scientific literature, the concept of historical consciousness is perceived as a broader concept in terms of scope compared to the concept of historical science. In addition to historical scientific knowledge, it also includes the set of spiritual and mental processes necessary for the perception of the past, present, and future by an individual human life, limited by the relative time-space framework and the establishment of a connection between them, as well as for giving a certain meaning to historical events and other such meanings. In the context of the meanings of history that we have considered above, the next question that arises is history an objective reality, or is it simply a form of subjective assessment that has a certain connection with the events that have occurred and, in many cases, does not contain the meaning of those events themselves, which includes, transfers, these events into the content? If the second part of this question is closer to the truth, then history will in any case act as a reality rich in elements of subjective assessment, as well as subjective understanding and perception. At this point, we can only think about the possibility that the subjective may be less or more. The context in which the content of the concept of history is interpreted also depends significantly on the association between that concept and this or that philosophical system, and on the approach to history within the framework of which philosophical system. For example, in a number of philosophical systems belonging to the ancient, medieval, and even early modern periods, history does not act only as a form of studying and evaluating events occurring in society as a closed social system. Thus, here there is no rational and deterministic, causal regularity between historical events, the scope of which is limited only to the closed social system. On the contrary, the possibilities of the influence of supernatural forces existing outside the social system and incomprehensible to human intelligence on historical events are great. However, since the philosophy of the Enlightenment gradually dominated the perception of history as the result of human activity, here human cognition has the function of revealing the regularity underlying historical events occurring within the closed social system and reconstructing, historical reality. Of course, the possibilities of the influence of the natural system on the social system are not denied here. On the contrary, in the trend of geographical determinism we observe the prominence of these possibilities of influence, but in any case, only humans or various social groups are accepted as subjects of historical processes here. If we proceed from the methodology put forward by the philosophy of phenomenology in the modern era, then we can note that human consciousness forms part of the meaning-making of the world, evaluation of the world within a certain framework of meaning, through perception, imagination, and language acts. In this context, the assessment of historical events will also depend to a significant extent on human consciousness, perception, and imagination, and the linguistic possibilities used by the person when describing these events. If we proceed from the methodology of approaching history in Hegel's Philosophy of History, the research we conduct within the framework of this book takes place in the contexts of reflective history and philosophical history. Thus, Hegel divides his methodology of approaching history into three groups. The first in this division, natural history, implies the provision of information only about individual historical events and processes that occurred in the past by people who directly witnessed them, and this information is considered reliable and recorded by researchers. However, the next historical approach method, reflective history, is not limited to any time period, but also analyzes the entire historical processes that have occurred on a societal and global scale. In Hegel's terminology, reflective history expresses universal history. But in Hegel's methodology, reflective history is not limited to universal history, but also includes pragmatic history. When studying the historical past, this history is of great importance for the present, and critical history, criticism of previous historical interpretations in order to determine their truth and validity. In the division in which Hegel's name is mentioned, philosophical history, philosophy of history, is in third place. Leaving aside Hegel's philosophical ideas characteristic of the German idealist school, in our study, in accordance with Hegel's philosophical history methodology, the following three fundamental points will be in the center of attention. 1. The characterization of universal history against the background of universal causal relationships existing between various social structures, periods, and civilizations. 2. The factors determining universal historical development. 3. The directions of universal historical development.